Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to join us in this discussion today. I'm Tricia Rakes, co-founder of the Rakes Foundation, and I am so glad to see all of you here today because what is happening in public schools across our country is deeply disturbing. A robust educational system is essential to supporting the healthy development of our young people. And today we're going to focus on the serious risks facing our public schools, our educators, our young people, and their families. Over the past few months, Jeff and I have been increasingly concerned about laws that result in banning books and teacher intimidation has swept through numerous states. Our foundation has been focused on supporting young people's growth and development for 2 decades. And I can say with certainty that I have never seen anything like this backlash before. Young people today are fluent in issues of race and identity. They're actively seeking the whole truth about our history, and they are hungry for our country to live up to its ideals. We're all here because we support those aspirations. And we know that we can't allow regressive policies to drag a generation of our young people backwards. I know we face many critical issues in our country, and that creates competing attention for how we as donors best use our dollars to support the priorities that we care about. But I suspect that by the end of our conversation, you too will be inspired to support the essential work of Color of Change, because I know that each of you cares about our young people and about creating the communities that help them thrive. So I am very excited that we are joined today by Heather Mcgee. She is the board chair of Color of Change and also the author of the new book, The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Highly recommend the book. But Heather has been designing and promoting solutions to inequity for decades. She's testified before Congress, she's drafted legislation, and she's developed impactful campaigns that have changed millions of lives. She helped build the think and do tank called Demos and served as its president for 4 years. Under her leadership, Demos moved its original idea for debt-free college into the center of the 2016 presidential debate. Demos also argued before the Supreme Court to protect voting rights and helped win pro-voter reforms in 5 states over 2 years. But what I admire most about Heather is the way she helps us all see that diversity is our country's greatest strength, and how she expertly dismantles zero-sum thinking, showing us all the way to build a just and equitable America where everyone feels that sense of belonging and is valued. In a world that feels increasingly fractured and divisive, Heather's message is not only a breath of fresh air, it's essential to creating the kind of country we want to pass on to our young people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather to get us started.
Thank you so much, Tricia. Thank you for your leadership, your vision, your generosity, your strategic giving, and most importantly, for your support of Color of Change, the organization that I give the most to in terms of my personal giving and in terms of my time now as the volunteer chair of the board. I do it because Color of Change is quite simply the most strategic, nimble, and powerful organization that we have fighting for truth and justice. And boy, do we need it now more than ever. I want to thank all of you and Giving Compass for gathering today for this important conversation. You know, I think a lot of us in our lives, when we are dismayed by what we read in the news or what comes across our social media feed, sometimes think, well, the children are our future and they are going to save us. And exactly as Tricia said, there is reason to believe that. The youngest generation is the most impatient with the excesses and the failures of previous generations to solve big problems. They know what the stakes are, namely because of the pandemic of climate change, their experience of seeing leadership fail. And for the most diverse generation in American history, the issue of racial justice and social justice is not an add on, it is central to the way that they see the world. And that, my friends, is why the right wing, in its long term agenda to defund the public goods that we all rely on, to shrink the public sector and the public sphere, and to make minority rule the law of the land, has chosen to attack our public schools and our children's freedom to learn. And I want to be very clear that I feel privileged to be working for, in a volunteer capacity, an organization that is really at the front lines. As Rashad Robinson, our fearless leader, will explain later, this is a multiracial group of members who have dedicated themselves to focusing on racial justice. And now is the time more than ever for this organization to have the resources it needs to strategically counteract the attacks on our children's freedom to learn, which are all a part of a strategy of shrinking the capacity of one of the last remaining public goods in the country, and most importantly, of the foundation for a truly multiracial democracy, which is public education. In my book, The Sum of Us, I expose the multi-generational right-wing attack on public goods and the way that the right, which ultimately has an economic agenda about concentrating wealth, about making sure that government is too small to regulate, too small to tax, has used the weapon of culture war racial grievance in order to set up a false zero-sum story. The idea that progress for people of color has to come at white people's expense. And it has been through the channel of the goods that we hold in common, the public goods. In my book, I talk about it in terms of the public pools that used to dot the American landscape, and that in many parts of the country, not just in the South, were drained by white officials as opposed to integrating them in the wake of the civil rights movement. This here that we are seeing sweep across the country is a zero-sum drained pool strategy. I want to be very clear that all of the investigative journalism that I have been seeing, and I've been a real rabid consumer of it, has shown that this is a campaign funded by the same people who wanted to put Trump justices on the court, the same people who are really focused on a very partisan strategy, and they are inflating and trying to create a sense of panic, namely among white parents, that the idea of diversity, racial justice and equity, even social and emotional learning, is somehow a Trojan horse for something that they should be very afraid of. And I want to be clear that these laws are not popular across the country at a high level. 88% of the country believes that we should teach all of American history, both the best parts and the worst parts. I want to be clear that this has been a massive overreach of the right wing, and we should be taking the moral high ground to organize multiracial groups of parents and students to understand that we will not ban books in America, that we are not afraid of the truth, and to arm groups of people in communities across the country to reclaim what has been the single most powerful force in social change in my lifetime, the largest social movement in American history, which has been the movement for racial justice. Now, as we talk about this, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Rashad and Jade about the plan to win on these issues, about the strategy, I want us to keep in mind a core question, which is who is benefiting from this chaos at our local school board and classroom level? Who is benefiting when school teachers are afraid to teach about issues of diversity, about our full history? Who is benefiting when there are financial penalties and administrative costs and burdens dealing with public records requests that are being foisted onto our schools that are already at the breaking point due to 2+ years of the pandemic? Suburban white kids are not benefiting from this chaos. They're not benefiting from financial penalties and teachers who are burnt out and leaving. The only people who are benefiting are right-wing partisans who ultimately have an economic agenda. And that's why it's so important that we expose the lies. It's so important that we give young people and their parents a way to unite around the issues that really keep up working families and parents, the kinds of things that are really a part of an agenda for families, things like canceling student debt, universal child care, paid family leave, elder care. These are the issues where ultimately Black, white, and brown parents and families are united in their desire for common solutions. And if we can make that kind of a morally infused organizing base and the pivot to the agenda that really matters for families, we can leave this strategy behind in the annals of history. And so with that, I want to turn it over to my colleagues who have been really leading this fight and ask Rashad and Jade to come on. Welcome, Rashad. And welcome, Jade. I'm going to send it right over to you directly, Rashad, for a presentation. And then, as you all know, we will be able to have time for discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Heather, for sharing those powerful words. In so many ways, I'm going to pick it up from there. And what Heather said, I think, cannot be overstated. The consequences to not only this backlash that we are undergoing, but the consequences to not taking it on and going on the offense are deep. Every time race is weaponized, we all lose, whether it is the war on drugs, whether it's our inability to have healthcare, whether it is sort of all of the consequences to the effective ways our opponents have been able to weaponize race in order to cut public goods, in order to take away the opportunities from all of us. I'm going to take us through a presentation that will really sort of outline a lot of the work that we are doing at Color of Change. All of the ways in which our organization is both poised, positioned, and experienced in this area of building campaigns, of fighting back, but most importantly, of going on the offense and marching us forward. That's going to be the work I'm going to share. For those of you who are new to us, who might not know that much about Color of Change, we are a 17-year-old organization that was founded in the aftermath of a flood, which was Hurricane Katrina. It was caused by bad decision makers and turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. Black folks were on their roofs begging for the government to do something and left to die. And Katrina illustrated a lot of things that really animate our theory of change to this day. That despite all the things that we knew, geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what has happened to our planet, and all of the ways in which structural racism undergirds that, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. So much of our work is about channeling the engagement and energy of Black folks and allies of every race to hold institutions, corporations, media, and government accountable, and along the way, advance policies that work for all of us. I'm going to take us into these slides, and then we'll have some time for questions. Great. The first concept I really want to start off with is this idea that when you win, you lose. And I know you're probably wondering, what does he mean by that? What I mean by that is I think it's incredibly important that we start from a place of recognizing all that racial justice has won over the last several years. All of the ways in which the pushbacks that we are seeing are a result of winning, whether it is redefining the role of prosecutors in a lot of communities around the country, or it is making sure that Black history is taught in our schools. All of that has been part of winning. In the summer of 2020, when many people thought the best we could do in terms of activism was clap outside of our windows or uplift investigative journalism, it was racial justice that drove people into the streets, that pushed people to action, that led to the uptick in voter registration. So I want to start there because I think it's very important that as we receive and see these pushbacks, that we recognize that we have to operate from a place of power. I know this not only from my experience in the racial justice movement, but from my years in leadership in the LGBT rights movement. From 2005 to 2011, I served as the #2 and head of programs at the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, known as GLAAD. And during my time at GLAAD, I oversaw a lot of the cultural campaigns that really led to an advancement in LGBT equality and the culture change that we're all experiencing today. But I got to GLAAD in 2005, right after the 2004 elections in November. And when I started to look at what I wanted to do next, the 2004 elections, 13 anti-gay ballot measures passed around the country that actually was used to mobilize. Those anti-gay ballot measures were used to mobilize the right. The LGBT community was blamed for Kerry's loss in the 2004 election. And many people thought that the gay community had overstepped. Maybe folks should just ask for domestic partnership or civil unions. But the community pressed on, poised and recognizing that though their wins had to add up. Then moving forward, 2008, early 2008, we won in the courts around marriage equality in California, only to have it ripped away at the ballot with Prop 8. I served on the steering committee of Prop 8 and watched as people responded and engaged out in the streets, mobilized and pushed back. People continued to recognize. One of the things I recognize about the LGBT movement that we sometimes can have challenge with in the racial justice movement because of the way that generational wealth works, the ways in which people are able to be able to have the access to donate and engage, is that so many of the donors to the LGBT community, LGBT people who had wealth and had access to resources, were used to losing. They were used to losing people in their lives who didn't accept them when they came out. They were used to losing conversations about their dignity at the kitchen table. They were used to losing jobs and status in the community. They lost people they loved to a disease that our country turned its back on. And so they recognize that to lose is part of the journey to win. So the question I'm inviting you all into is, how do we be in greater solidarity together? How do we join together and recognize that along the way towards our victories that we will have losses, that the Disney-fied story of social progress is not a real story, and that as we win, we will see deep pushbacks. We will see the forces that we are defeating use everything at their disposal, and we have to find the ways to push forward. We have to do that work. The people with the most to lose are oftentimes not the people that are going to fight the hardest. But we know the folks who have everything already on the line are going to do that fighting. And at Color of Change, our members recognize that. Our members are the people in the community facing the brunt of this and are ready and willing and able to fight. Because we recognize that racial justice is not just powerful for racial justice, but racial justice is a powerful force multiplier to allow us to win across so many issues. Racial justice is not charity. Racial justice is strategy. And what I want us to invite us into is a conversation of recognizing that racial justice is not what we get out of a true democracy, but racial justice is our path to a true democracy. It is not only the most powerful motivating force we have in this country to get people engaged and activated and raising their voices, it is also a powerful lens that we can use to determine if the things we are working for and fighting for, from climate equity to fighting back against the attacks on a women's right to choose, to all the things that are happening in our education system, racial justice is a powerful vehicle for mobilization and a powerful lens to determine whether or not if what we are winning is actually truly serving all of the people we need to serve. And so we have seen one well-funded backlash after another, and this time we need to respond differently. Our opponents would like nothing more for us to all go into our individual corners, and the people who are fighting on this issue and fighting on that issue and fighting on this issue, and to fight the policies. But we actually have to fight the people and the institutions, the enablers that have made this possible. If we are not dismantling and taking on the infrastructure that put us in harm's way, we will not actually have the power to defeat what's ahead of us, but we also won't be using our resources effectively. We will not do the work to actually build the momentum necessary for elections and all the other ways we need people to show up. 3 years from now, and we think very clearly in goals, is like we want to make sure that the work we are doing not only has undermined the trust in those forces that are putting us in harm's way, that we've created a critical mass of people who believe and recognize this, and that we can mobilize them in new ways, and that we have more active, engaged people, educated, trained, and mobilizing on the grounds, that we can take on the enablers, but that we can also mobilize and push back in local communities. I want to say that Color of Change is not the only organization working on this issue, and we think it's important that there's an ecosystem out there. There are the academics and public intellectuals, the folks like the African American Policy Forum and Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. There's litigation and policy advocacy groups like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and others. There's local community organizing that's happening, and many of those groups we are in touch with and engaged with. And there's all sorts of powerful work that Jeff and Tricia have been very powerful in supporting, and so many of you as well in the education sector. We have been engaged across the board. What we are recognized is the need for a powerful pressure campaign, corporate accountability, local to national organizing effort that actually builds power, recognizing that we can't just have presence on this issue. Visibility and awareness, retweets and shout outs from this stage are not going to be enough. Power is the ability to change the rules. And that's what we have to do, because our opponents are working every single day to change the very rules of education, to change the rules in conversation about race, and to change the rules in conversation about how to move this country forward. So that means turning defense into offense. We have 5 kind of key areas that we're going to be focusing on, and then me and my colleague are going to go through a couple of them. One is launching an aggressive multimedia campaign. We've already started doing the mapping. We've brought creative and other ad firms in, and we will be rolling out this fall a set of really offensive ad campaigns that actually invite people in to this discussion, that help people put themselves inside of being on the right side of history, which is so important. Enlisting and challenging influential institutions, both challenging those who are on the wrong side and bringing more people on our side, supporting the grassroots efforts to fight back, both with our digital advocacy infrastructure and providing more support to public leaders and figures, more narrative framing, all the work to help raise the floor on how many people are out there talking about this issue and giving people the tools to do it. And then, of course, the research, oppos work, and all the other things that focus on undermining our opponents' momentum. So in terms of launching an aggressive multimedia ad campaign, this is really focused on creating sort of a whole set of work, a whole set of campaigns, both digital, billboards, radio, others that actually focus on inviting people in to being on the right side of history, to being part of progress, to seeing them connected to a long line of people who have been attacked. We've already started this in a number of different ways, but we will be working to roll this campaign out, both in terms of the creative work that actually is going to be necessary, as well as the work to actually get these ads up in the world will all require a level of resource and support. This is a type of work that Color of Change is known for in many ways. We already have a lot of deep relationships with billboard companies and others. We're already starting with leveraging some free space that's been given to us. But as we start moving up and amping up this campaign, we're going to need to increasingly have to pay for some of the messages that we believe are going to be necessary to get out in the world and really invite people into this discussion. Now I want to turn it over to Jade.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jade Magnus Ognaki. I'm Senior Director of Campaigns at Color of Change, and I'm really excited to talk to you all today. In fall 2019, Color of Change began targeting 5 of the largest textbook and educational material publishers. So that's C Engage Learning, College Board, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, HMH Learning Technology, McGraw-Hill Education, Pearson Education. And we were surveying sort of the corporate enabler landscape and trying to identify who are the corporations who had the power to influence bodies and influence students and parents in this larger anti-CRT fight. Especially because we've won in this space before. In 2019, Color of Change successfully campaigned to have College Board roll out pre-colonial Asian and African history as part of their AP curriculum. So we knew that we had fought and won in this space before. We wanted these companies to develop really strong educational standards rooted in accurate history. What we could see and what we have seen is that school districts, school boards are using educational materials to rewrite history, to whitewash history, and refuse to tell our children the truth. We immediately launched an inside strategy campaign where we reached out to these companies and demanded that they develop editorial standards which were stronger than they currently are, committing to teaching history. I remember when I was in school, there was a huge scandal about Houghton Mifflin teaching students in Texas that slavery was compared to an internship. And so we understand with the nefarious leaders, Ron DeSantis in Florida, so many of the school boards all across the country, that things could actually get much worse. In engaging in our inside strategy, we learned a couple of things. One, when we first reached out, these textbook companies did not really see what was at stake. Two, that there were 2 industry leaders, particularly Houghton Mifflin and Pearson, who already had really strong what they called anti-racist educational standards, editorial standards. And so we have been continuing to work with them in negotiation, especially as the anti-CRT fight is getting stronger and scarier every day. I think a lot of these textbook companies believe that they could play the middle, but especially when under Ron DeSantis leadership, when the education department in Florida has banned 41% of textbooks because they touch on things like Black history, because they touch on things like socio-emotional learning, we understand that there is a larger fight there. And we're really looking to ramp up our tactics. As I said, many of the companies look to stay in the middle, but at Color of Change, we're used to playing the long game when it comes to corporate accountability. We understand that corporations, as we saw in the Trump administration, may not feel comfortable. They may try to play the middle. They are trying to negotiate with terrorists at the beginning, but as the stakes get higher, we need to ramp up our tactics. We need to ramp up our campaigns to make them much stronger and do larger actions. We have had some success in this space though. Early this year, we found out that Todd Houston, a College Board vice president, was also advancing legislation HB 1134 in Indiana, which would allow parents to sue school districts who taught Black history. Thanks to our previous campaigning in the space and to our relationships at College Board, we were able to successfully negotiate for him to be fired. But this is one small intervention in the much larger ecosystem of corporate enablers and anti-CRT education. In every state, there are textbook companies, there are local businesses who are seeking to go with the flow and not fight back against the anti-CRT legislation. Rashad, you can go to the next slide. Similarly, across the country, school boards and teachers and parents are on the front lines of local anti-CRT attacks launched by conservative actors and right-wing groups. We're really looking to expand our base and build stronger support for local leaders who are standing up to these racist attacks. And we're really looking to develop the skills and resources of these local leaders through training and some of the tools that we already have, our existing resources and some of our organizing tools. To begin with, at Color of Change, we have launched a training series that equips frontline leaders with the skills to launch and grow petitions, tell and share their impact stories, and develop really local winnable campaigns. We really, really want to scale up our training series to execute training with greater frequency and timeliness, while developing and publishing online toolkits that can sort of distribute the trainings in places where they may not be able to access it. We also are looking to lend our staff capacity to local campaigns in ways that ensure more opportunities are available. And so, Rashad, you can go to the next slide. For example, we launched our first training series last fall. We were able to educate over 100 educators using our Organize For platform, which is sort of an open source platform where local community groups and local activists can start petitions on the platform and access campaign resources by way of Color of Change campaigners. So for example, when we trained these 100 educators, what they were able to do is identify local campaigns in their areas. We taught them how to identify the stakeholders, and then they worked with Color of Change staff to not only access our mailing list. So for example, if you are a teacher in Northern Vermont who is dealing with trying to fight back against the anti-CRT backlash, you would be able to not only upload your petition, but send your petition to all of the Color of Change members who are local in your area, bring attention to the fight, and leverage tactics like calls or emails to decision makers. Rashad, you can go to the next slide. One of the things that we're launching this summer is that we're really finding that the anti-CRT message is really salient and landing. The right has been really good at twisting the message. So for example, when we're fighting back against the Don't Say Gay bill, where we successfully campaigned for Disney to speak out publicly against it and make a statement because they weren't planning on doing that. What we're finding is that in talking to local members in Florida, they didn't understand the severity of the bill. They thought that it was something much milder. For example, not teaching children in kindergarten about sexual education. And so the message has been able to get skewed and really transform the way that parents think about the anti-CRT bills. And so what we're really looking to do is develop Color of Change Children's Carnival. We've had a lot of success in the past developing light political education events where people come, they're having fun, and they're also learning. We're launching these events in red and purple states. Our first one is in Houston, then we're going to Atlanta, Miami, and Philadelphia. And in creating an event that's really rooted in celebrating and honoring Black culture and Black history, there will be trivia, there will be a splash pad, there will be games and prizes, and there will also be a light organizing training for local parents, teaching them how to talk to their friends and family members about the CRT backlash, and teaching them what is at stake, the fact that our children will not learn accurate history. Our goal is to train 500 parents by the end of the year and circle back to them, creating a cohort so that we're able to stay in constant communication and really develop a really nimble strategy to deal with some of the misinformation and disinformation that's popping up in the space. And I'll pass it back to Rashad.
So, you know, overall, one thing that we know is that, you know, part of this is also across the board, getting our folks on board and aligned with the message and the narratives that we need to move. Moving from defense to offense is the focus here. And as sort of Jade outlined some of those work that is happening, we are really trying to translate all of the engagement. Color of Change, as the largest online Black racial justice organization, reaching over 7 million people through email, reaching over 6.2 million through SMS, having social media platforms. We recognize that we have narrative infrastructure to also drive messages. We recognize that, you know, the fact of the matter is in this conversation of moving from defense to offense, we have to recognize that the opponents that are standing in the way are the same people that don't want evolution taught in schools. They don't want gay teachers. They didn't want girls to learn math. And now they want Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks to be canceled. And part of what we actually need to be doing is making sure we are making those larger connections, that we are not fighting issue by issue, but once again, building the momentum that will help take us into 2022 and beyond, recognizing that there is a way to win here and there's a way to turn this overreach, as Heather talked about, into an opportunity to win more for our communities down the line. Racial justice has been such a powerful force, And I just want to be clear with everyone that we have a history at Color of Change of being able to win campaigns, of being able to leverage our infrastructure to drive real change, of being able to hold corporations accountable and being able to connect with the community, Black folks and allies of every race in order to do that. But we need your support. And so this once again is the set of work that we are going to be undergoing, the ways in which we have already started engaging, and the ways that we will continue to engage over the next year and the years ahead. And so I will stop there so that we can move into questions and to a conversation. But really, once again, want to thank Jeff and Trisha and the Giving Compass team for hosting this conversation and selling us all into the very real challenges that we are facing. 5, 10, 15 years from now, we're all going to look back on this moment. We're going to think about what we did, how we engaged, how we worked to move us forward. And so much of the history that we sort of understand, the history that is right now trying to be banned from American history and from our children's learning, is a history of heroes, heroes of all races and backgrounds who stood up for what was right. This is a conversation and an opportunity to be part of being the protagonist in the next set of those stories. And when we look back 5, 10, 15 years from now, we will all have a story of what we did, how we engaged, who we were in this moment. And I guess this is just an invitation and an opportunity to be a hero in this story, in this fight, and to stand with the protagonists who are trying to do everything we possibly can, not just to fight against what's coming our way, but to fight for all of the things that we deserve and all the things that our communities deserve. I'll stop there. And I think Heather and Jade are going to come back on.
Great. Well, I'm just going to jump in here briefly, Rashad. Thank you, Rashad and Jade, for such a galvanizing presentation. I do want to encourage everybody on the webinar to add your questions to the chat. We really want to make sure we get to as many questions as possible. But while we are issuing that invitation, I just want to jump in with the first question. For both Rashad and Jade, these laws are spreading pretty rapidly across our country. But it does seem like the public at large is finally waking up somewhat to the dangers and are overwhelmingly against things like book banning. So I wanted to ask the question, what do you think it will take to engage people in this campaign in the midst of pandemic, a war, now a Supreme Court leak, and other ongoing efforts to jeopardize our democracy? And what are you seeing actually work in resisting these laws?
Yeah, I'll start and then I'll pass it over to you, Jade, and you should talk some really about the membership and what you're hearing in your work with the members. What we recognize is that we're constantly fighting on issues at Color of Change and making issues pop while there are so many other things happening, helping people to recognize the threats of big tech while we're also experiencing police violence. Helping people sort of recognize why an election is important to turn out for in the midst of voter suppression. People don't experience issues, we experience life, and the forces that hold us back are deeply interrelated. So much of what we're trying to do every day is make those connections. And so we're not showing up to communities and say, only care about this issue. We are there every single day pointing people towards a range of issues they should care about. And so when we raise the alarm, we are not just talking about one issue over here, but really connecting these conversations to power and connecting these conversations to the forces that are trying to hurt our communities, put us in harm's way, and giving people the pathways to be powerful on these issues. And that, I think, is most exciting about this work. That is why it's a multi-channel work. That's why we need to be out in the air with billboards, with ads, doing that work. That is why we need to give people pathways to hold the enablers and those who are pushing this legislation accountable. And that is why we need to do the work to empower, engage, educate, and then motivate and mobilize our base. But and with that, I want Jade to talk a little bit about sort of the motivation of the base.
Yeah, 100%. I think that at Color of Change, we're really, really good at, if there's not a moment, making a moment, right? As Rashad was saying, teaching people how to care about tech accountability in the midst of a larger fight against police violence. One of the things that we've really seen, one of the spaces that we're able to create a center of gravity is really with our Color of Change Children's Carnival. I think for a lot of people, for example, with Disney, we saw the Don't Say Gay bill, and people are looking for things to do. And one thing that Color of Change is really great at is creating a matrix of engagement for different members to engage with the issue in different spaces. So for example, going through some of the things that I named earlier, if you're interested in fighting back against CRT backlash, maybe you came to the Children's Carnival and it was really interesting to you and you like the organizing training. And so the next step for you might be you have a one pager and you can go talk to a fellow parent or bring it to your PTA and discuss the issue. Or you can say, actually, there is a principal around the corner at that school who is fighting to ban, a Rosa Parks picture book. I can start a petition on Organize For and access campaign resources through Color of Change. Or you can say, I don't have time to do those things, but I can write an email, and you can access our technology to send emails to the educational materials companies. That's what's really great about having all of these different levers, from a corporate strategy to our Organize For member-led strategy to an in-person strategy, is that no matter who you are, what your capacity is, or how much time you have, Color of Change has already thought ahead and figured out a way for you to have an intervention and take a meaningful action for the issue.
Great. Thank you so much, Jade. It's really inspiring. So there are a couple of questions coming in the Q&A. Just a reminder, as Tricia said, please click on the Q&A icon in your Zoom and go ahead and ask your question. Only I and the staff will be able to see it, and so you can be completely anonymous in your question, and I'll just bring it to Rashad and Jade. The first one is my favorite question, which is simply, great information today. What would be a significant donation for this cause? How can I help?
Yes, that's a great question. We right now, over the next year and a half, 2 years, are trying to raise between $5 and $10 million for this work. Okay. And we are going to be doing it through building blocks. And we probably have raised about $1 million up to this point for this work. And so, and we're able to move some general operating funding to support this work because of how important this work is and how urgent it is to everything else that we're working on. And so with that said, because I don't know each person's individual capacity, I want people to be able to make gifts that are meaningful and at the scale of how we see this problem and how we see the challenges that we are facing, and also recognizing that we know the opponents, we know their long game, we know what they want and what they hope to have happen. And I think we have to give with that in mind as well, because quite frankly, like at the end of the day, the resources that we are facing, the entrenched forces that we are facing are emboldened. And this is part of their strategy that is not just connected to what they want to do in our schools, but what they want to do to sort of all of the progress that we've achieved in this country, and all of the ways in which so many communities have advanced. And we'll be seeing rollbacks if we do not find collective ways to build power and defeat these attacks.
Thank you so much, Rashad. The second question is from Ingrid Dankmeyer saying, can you speak to the shift that seems to be afoot for the right to target social and emotional learning? I would like to take this one to start because I've been really looking into this. What we have to remember that one of the architects of this strategy, Christopher Rufo from the Heritage Foundation, was very clear that they just made this up, right? That the goal was to create a boogeyman phrase and de-index its meaning, as he said, and re-index it to just include everything that the left is doing that the right doesn't like, right? And remember what the right doesn't like, because they've been sold ad nauseum on an hourly basis a story around the Great Replacement, the idea that it's in the left's political strategy to replace white Americans with people from all over the world who are not white, in order to gain power, right? That is actually, that zero-sum story is the way that the majority of Republicans see the world now, unfortunately. And so this idea that schools are sort of indoctrinating young people by teaching them anything about race or equity or justice is part of that core story. Now, social and emotional learning, which for some people who are education activists and advocates and practitioners, know exactly what that means, which is basically understand. It's what teachers do every day, right? It's basically giving students the understanding to build character, to be able to relate to one another, to have empathy, to have critical thinking skills, all of that, right? What we need to succeed, the promise, basically, of education in the 21st century. Why is that suddenly in the crosshairs? And I think it's very clear that ultimately, because critical race theory is not being taught in schools, because so much of this is a boogeyman, but because they are speaking to their base on a daily basis about this issue, they need to find more things that are actually happening in schools that they can de-index, right? Take away the meaning of and promote a new meaning of that says this is a threat to your children and your way of life. And so questions about, how are you feeling emotionally as you're puzzling through this math problem? All of the social and emotional learning that we know works and is essential, and ask any teacher, you're going to find a lot more about that than you're going to find something by Kimberly Crenshaw or Bell Hooks, or, right, an actual sort of higher level, sophisticated lesson about the role of systemic racism in America. And so that's why they're trying to create a new boogeyman out of the much more pervasive social and emotional learning. Again, but I think fundamentally they're also doing this because they are deeply disconnected from reality, from where most parents and families are, and it is yet another sign of overreach. And that's what I really want to underscore in this conversation, is that, just bluntly, oftentimes our leadership in our movement, or more our political movement, is not very representative of the multiracial base of the movement, and so often is pretty scared to talk about race forcefully and with moral conviction. There's still a hangover of fear of white grievance and white backlash that creates a lot of self-censorship about the issues that are actually the most important, not only to the people of color, but also to the white people who have joined the broad Democratic coalition and progressive coalition and care about these values. Put simply, oftentimes white Americans are in this multiracial coalition that is anti-racist because of their views on race, right? Not in spite of them, but because of them. And so there has been relative silence at the top about this. There has not been the air war. You have not seen people, speaking up against book bans as loudly, either from politics or in our political ads and media, as there has been on the right. And that's going to change with this strategy, and that is really beginning to change. But fundamentally, we've got to reharness that sense of sort of moral high ground on this, and coming after social and emotional learning is yet another sign of the overreach and, frankly, the vulnerability.
Just to add to what Heather said, which was so on point and so important, I hope everyone took that in, is that part of what ends up happening when we don't fight back, when our side says things like, well, we're not teaching CRT, or this is not about CRT. It leaves a lot of people wondering, so then what is it about? What do we actually care about on our side? When our response is, but they're lying, we're not actually teaching CRT, we're not actually doing the work to take our opponents on. And when our side looks like we are afraid to talk about race, when we are afraid to actually talk about the issues at hand, when we're afraid to talk about what does it mean to teach American history and all parts of American history, then we are sort of actually leaving the conversation for other people to define. And that does not put us in the place that we need to actually win. And so part of the invitation into this work is an invitation to not just be on the defense once again, but to be on the offense. And I know I say that a lot, but we do not score any points on the defense. And we actually have to do the work of taking what our opponents are putting on the table, which is an opportunity for us to actually talk about the things that we care about. And part of what we care about is social progress, and so much of social progress, so much of what we saw even in the uprisings of 2020 was because people had been learning about history and learning about this country and felt compelled to do something about injustices that they saw on their screens, to fight back and to move us forward. That's what our opponents want to stop. The opportunity to not allow this momentum to go away, but to use the wins that we've been able to accumulate over the years and allow that to power our work forward is what we hope for right now.
Great. So the next question is a very good one, and I want to make sure that I communicate it very clearly. So we've been talking about our base, and the questioner wants to know what Color of Change's research says about A, which kinds of people constitute our base, and B, if, like the right wing, this base is attached to organized institutions like faith organizations, PTAs, community organizations, political parties, social media networks, right? Is the base attached to organized institutions? And C, what messaging research tells us about the vocabulary and concepts that resonate for those in the base or for those that need to be recruited and activated. So who is it? Where are they? And what messaging works?
Jade, you want to take who is it and where are they? And I'll take on the messaging. Perfect.
Totally. So when Color of Change talks about our base, it's sort of two separate groups. We have our online membership, which is largely multiracial, millions of people, and we have our squad members, which is sort of like a second level of commitment of Color of Change members who meet in person. They attend things like the Color of Change Children's Carnival. They plan things like the Color of Change Children's Carnival. And they're the people we're probably in closest communications with. We have a Color of Change staff member located, an organizer located near where all of the squads are. And so they tend to be Black women, middle-aged Black women with children, some a little bit older. Our squads operate a little bit different than a traditional, maybe I used to work for a union, so like union membership. It's part social club, part political activity. And so our squads come together for things like walking groups and community service events, as well as protest and petition deliveries for our campaigns, for our larger campaigns. And so what we've seen that we're really looking to do is, especially with the Color of Change Children's Carnival, is that we are really trying to partner with large churches. So for example, in Houston, we're partnering with a large Black church called Bethel. They're allowing us to use their space. They're passing it out to their members. It's one of the largest Black churches in Houston. Additionally, we are creating space for local organizations, local community groups to table and spread the word about their organizations. I'll pass it to you, Rashad.
Great. And so, that's the Color of Change base. And as I think about the larger sort of base on this issue, sort of beyond Color of Change and the research that I've shown, I think that, we are seeing when we talk about the issue as teaching American history and teaching full American history, we actually see our base as quite expansive. We see suburban women with us of all races. We actually see a base that's actually larger than the base that propelled Joe Biden into office. And we have, and those folks absolutely are connected to religious institutions. They are connected to their kids, after school sports and in other programs. These, inside of communities that are, more urban, where we have seen less of the attacks have resonance, except where they sort of these communities exist inside of states that are trying to move statewide efforts. But, you know, in places where that are more urban, we actually see communities that couldn't imagine not having all sorts of things that are connected to race and connected to celebration of Black history and Latino history and all the other sort of histories that make up multiracial communities and that add to the full education of those communities. Some of the things that we know absolutely motivates people is helping people sort of see right in front of them the harm, helping them see in front of them sort of what our opponents are trying to do, and giving people very clear things that they are trying to do. And so when I talked about that, these are the same people that are trying to, you know, prevent evolution from being taught, that don't want gay teachers, that don't want girls to learn math, that want to cut public education funding, and now they want Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks to not be taught in our schools. That's the type of messaging that we actually have to move with, because it's messaging that both sort of is very clear about what our opponents are doing. It's not arguing back and forth about CRT or the issue, because we do not win when we're arguing back and forth about something that is not actually being taught in our schools. But it does provide people an understanding of what the larger underlying agenda is at play that is working to prevent their kids from having the type of full education that they need in order to be successful in our society. And that is what this is all about. And I know that we're about to sort of wrap up and turn it over to Jeff, but I do think that I think it's incredibly important that this is an opportunity to also weaken the sort of energy and the grip that the opponents that have been trying to attack all of the progress this country has experienced, and trying to attack all of the ways in which we've been able to advance and move forward, that we leverage this overreach to actually win, that we are not embarrassed by the fact that we want to teach a full education, that we are not embarrassed by the fact that we want our kids of all races to learn about this history, because this history of social progress is a multiracial history. It's a history of many races coming together to fight for a better tomorrow, to overcome inequities, to overcome injustice, and in the face of all of those things, to achieve. And so that is a story of people of all backgrounds, but it is also a story of Black leadership at the center that was key to making this country better. And they believe if they can, you know, cut that out of the story, it will make us not appreciate all of the beautiful gifts that each of us bring to this story and bring to this conversation, and most importantly, bring to this country. And so I just want to thank all of you for joining us, because this is part of the work of finding the resources, of building the support so that we can do all the things necessary so we can be part of that sort of protagonist story that we get to look back on years from now. So let me turn it back over to Heather, who I think is going to bring in Jeff.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rashad and Jade, for this conversation, of course, for your work. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Rakes to close us out. He's the co-founder of the Rakes Foundation. He's a former CEO of the Gates Foundation, where he led the foundation's efforts to promote equity for people around the world. And he was president of Microsoft's business division before that. We had the pleasure of meeting last year for a conversation for Gates Foundation staff and alumni about the history of racism, our current battle for a fair democracy, and everything in between. Since the last remaining question was another, how can we support this work? I am very excited to have Jeff close us out. I've heard he has a strong reputation as a closer. So take it away, Jeff, and thank you.
Well, great. I want to thank all the panelists, and I want to thank you, Heather, for your absolutely profound work, which inspires us to what we should all aspire to: dismantling zero-sum thinking, shining a light on diversity as our country's greatest strength. Trish and I attended Town Hall Seattle on Saturday evening this past weekend to hear Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's traveling the country on her 1619 Project book tour, and she made a comment that strongly resonated with Tricia and me. And in this context, I believe it's going to resonate with you. She said, if you actually believe that we are a great country can withstand the truth. A great country doesn't have to lie about itself. So let me put that into my own words. I believe we are a great country. We can withstand the truth. In fact, we can use a full teaching of our history to be a more perfect union. Now, as Tricia said earlier, we rely on schools to help prepare young people to enter the world as adults. Learning about our nation's full history enables young people to be proud and motivated Americans who know where we've improved as a country and where there is work left to do. It encourages young people to develop into the curious thinkers and empathetic leaders we need. It helps them build confidence, understand current events, navigate relationships in an increasingly diverse America, and start practicing the skills they'll need in their daily lives, including at work. I feel strongly that business leaders should be concerned about this backlash to progress. Successful companies increasingly see that they are at a competitive advantage when they develop a workplace culture of belonging. They want to attract younger talent that values inclusion. A recent survey found that 80% of CEOs recognized empathy as being key to their employees' success, and therefore their company's success. Empathy and cultures of belonging go hand in hand to build success by driving collaboration and more effective problem solving. We believe that efforts to take education backward and weaponize progress will weaken our democracy, exacerbate racial and gender inequity, and diminish American competitiveness. We think the progress we each seek in other facets of American life will get much harder if we don't turn back this threat. We've seen this movie before. It does not end well. And that's why the Rakes Foundation has stepped up its efforts to support leaders like Colors of Change. Decades of progress are at stake if we can't muster the resources and will to push back against this censorship campaign in schools. I hope that you'll join us in supporting the work of Color of Change. We can win this fight and protect our schools, but it will take all of us working together. Harmful legislation is much easier to block than it is to undo. So your support is critical right now when we have a chance to stop these laws from ever hitting the books. So thank you for joining us today, and please, please join us to support the important work of Color of Change. Thank you.